Hello and welcome everyone to today's LinkedIn Live event, Planning Joint Clinical Assessment, Tackling Challenges and Engaging Patients, hosted by Justin Stindt Consultants and admedicum. I'm Rob Platika from admedicum. I'll be one of your moderators for today's discussion. The EU's Joint Clinical Assessment came into effect just in January 2025, bringing a structured approach to evaluating both new oncology drugs and ATMPs across Europe. While this harmonized process aims to enhance transparency and collaboration, the industry faces pressing challenges, from concerns about duplicated efforts to tight timelines for dossier preparation and PICO framework anticipation. Equally critical is the evolving role of patients in shaping HTA and reimbursement decisions, a topic gaining momentum under the JCA framework. Today, we're very privileged to have two experts guiding us through these complexities. Justin Stindt of Justin Stindt Consultants will unpack the challenges and opportunities of JCA, sharing strategies to navigate this new landscape. And my colleague, Dr. Andreas Reimann, will with exploring patient engagement as the new prerequisite for market access, to highlight how timely involvement and patient preference data can drive successful outcomes. So please stay tuned for a dedicated question and answer after the two presentations. And we encourage you to share any questions that you have in the chat, which we will be monitoring closely. Let's dive in. Justin, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob, and welcome everybody. My name is Justin Stindt. I'm the founder and CEO of Justin Stindt Consultants, and we would like to share with you today some key insights on the joint clinical assessment. It's fair to say that we've really entered a new era of market access in January 2025 as the joint clinical assessment process is now live. And of course, it's very important for the industry to embrace it and to prepare for it, because this will now apply for most new products, but over the next few years, it will roll out to all new products. And of course, we will tell you all about this. So the first thing that we wanted to give you is to set the stage, is a bit of an overview of the overarching objectives of the JCA, but also some of the challenges that the industry and we perceive. So the joint HTA process in Europe, it stems from an overarching objective to reduce duplication and streamline efforts and reduce inequalities in terms of patient access to innovative treatments. Of course, we have all seen examples where products are just available in the EU5, and then smaller countries either do not get served or get served later. And so that was one of the overarching ideas of the JCA to try and ensure a streamlined process that would apply for all of Europe. So the idea is that rather than just the national HTA processes, as we have seen so far, that there would be the European joint clinical assessment that would be conducted more or less in parallel to the EMA procedure. And then, of course, as the health policy is still a member state competency, the actual decision-making about reimbursement and pricing would still be the national HTA and member state responsibility. So really the goals were to improve the reliability and efficiency of HTA, to streamline and minimize redundancy, provide high-quality HTA information for decision makers, and harmonize methodologies and good practices. However, it's important to state that from an industry perspective, looking at the current state of implementation, there are clearly some challenges. So first of all, there are clear concerns that the JCA will actually lead to a duplication of efforts, because the JCA process will come on top of national HTA processes. And of course, there are some very important underlying issues, such as the different willingness to pay across countries and differences in the reimbursement systems that the JCA will also not fix. So if there are significant differences in terms of patient access to medicines across Europe, it's not just because of a lack of a joint JCA or European HTA process, but there are, of course, other issues at play that the JCA will not solve. Nevertheless, it's, of course, a very important process to be aware of and to engage in, and at least it holds the promise of taking a step in this direction. Let's look at the implementation timeline here. So there have been several years of preparation, and as usual, it really accelerated towards the end. So there are a lot of the implementation acts that have just been published either late last year or early this year. So, but we now have seen the official go live. So January the 12th, 2025 marks the official launch of the JCA and the JSC. So in this first step, they will apply to all oncology drugs and ATMPs. There is still a little bit of uncertainty surrounding the medical devices JCA. So currently it looks like 2026 will see the inclusion of some high-risk medical devices for JCA, but the exact implementing acts and timelines have not been published yet. For medicines, we already know that from January 2028 onwards, they will extend to orphan drugs, and from 2030 onwards to all drugs. And what will be decisive is the date of the marketing authorization submission. So products that have submitted last year, they are off the hook for the JCA, but all new submissions to the EMA as of now in oncology drugs and ATMPs, they will have to go through the JCA. I wanted to give you a quick overview of all the different implementing acts, and there are quite a few. So don't worry, I will not go through the complete list. But what I just wanted to showcase here is that there are some of the key implementing acts that have been published, some relatively recently, but others have been out there for a little while. And however, the ones that you see highlighted in gray here are implementing acts and guidance documents that are still in preparation. So we will have to stay tuned in order to learn about the content of these. And as you will see, especially for the medical device part, there is still a staggered plan for these between Q1 and Q3 of this year for these documents to be released. Looking at the key big changes of this reform, we of course have the JCA, but also the JSC, the Joint Scientific Consultations. So for the JCA, we are looking at the assessment of the value of new technologies compared to existing ones in terms of safety and efficacy. And the overarching idea was that any information or data that would be required for the JCA should be submitted by the health technology developer only once at EU level. However, that obviously does not exclude further submissions of further data. So, for example, in oncology, it is very common that you would have a primary data cut of the clinical trial that would serve as the basis for the initial EMA submission, but then manufacturers would typically take further data cuts in order to get more mature overall survival data. And these can, of course, still be submitted on a national level at a later stage. In terms of the joint scientific consultations, the idea here is to foster an early dialogue between the health technology developer and HTA bodies and potentially the EMA in case of a parallel consultation to make sure that the evidence generated is fit for purpose for the JCA. We'll come back to those two separately, of course, in the course of the presentation. One important thing to bear in mind is that while the JCA process is an extensive process that will require a lot of preparation and efforts to complete, it's still just one part of all the processes that need to happen and fall in place for patients to access new medicines. So if you look at the bottom right here, we've circled in the JCA, which is more the clinical assessment of the evidence. However, as you probably know, HTA bodies and policymakers also rely on other assessments, for example, cost effectiveness or cost utility assessments, and these are not in scope of the JCA, so these would still be done at national level. And ultimately, the added benefit or the rating of the added benefit, that would still be a national decision. So we can still see cases where, for example, Germany decides that a product does provide an added benefit, but France could attribute an ASMR 5 to that product, which means no added benefit. And then ultimately, there will be the decision of the national authority, and pricing and reimbursement will still be negotiated on a country by country level, which unfortunately will, of course, still mean there could be disparities in terms of access to new medicines. The JSC that you see here at the top left corner will essentially feed into the development of the technology and the clinical evidence generation. So of course, the idea is that ideally you should go and pursue a JSC prior to the initiation of the pivotal clinical trials in order to make sure that you can embed the feedback into your evidence generation program. We have already alluded to it, but we just wanted to be really clear about what is assessed at the European level and what is assessed at the national level. So on a European level, as part of the joint clinical assessment, there will be the clinical assessment, so assessment of the data and the comparison of the benefits against the existing treatments. However, all other aspects, for example, economic aspects, social and ethical aspects, they will still be part of the national assessments. So in the national decision making, the JCA may only be one piece of the puzzle. There is guidance that the member states, they are required to give due consideration to the JCA reports. However, this wording deliberately leaves a certain discretion to the member states how they would interpret this. So whether they will fully adopt the JCA or rather consider it as one of many sources is still up to the discretion of the member states. And as already said, the JCA reports, they will not include any final judgment on the added value of a medicine. So they will rather evaluate methodological and statistical elements and the results, but then the member states will still perform their own appraisal and attribute the rate of added benefit that they consider appropriate. And of course, that will then be the platform for the price negotiations. For the joint scientific consultations, there are also a few key insights that we wanted to share with you. So first of all, the HDDs can request a JSC, sometimes also referred to as an early dialogue, to receive advice from HTA bodies on the evidence and data that are likely to be required during a JCA. It's also possible to go through the parallel EMA and HTA scientific advice route. So that possibility also exists. The JSC compared to the national consultations is also an interesting aspect because, of course, after January 2025, the member states are supposed to inform the coordination group when they carry out national scientific consultations on a product for which a JSC was conducted, but it is absolutely not excluded that this would be the case. And of course, it's very important to bear in mind that at least initially, the JSC will have limited capacity. So in this year, there can only be up to 10 JSCs. And if we, for example, think about the large number of scientific advice meetings the GBA in Germany would conduct, this is just a fraction of it. And so therefore, there will clearly be a role still for the national consultations. And we will also see later that there are a number of eligibility criteria to be met. So not all HTDs that would like to get a JSC will be eligible for one. And therefore, of course, it's important to consider the JSC in your strategy, but also to have a backup which could still rely on national scientific advice meetings or advisory boards that can yield similar insights. And one thing that we just wanted to alert you to, which is pretty hot off the press. So the European Commission just launched the first call for medicinal products for JSC. So you can apply for one. And if you want further details on the exact application process, don't hesitate to reach out. We can support you with this. And essentially, the idea is that there can be up to 10 JSCs in 2025. The idea is to increase the capacity in the following years, but this year it's probably going to be pretty challenging to snap up one of the few slots. And right now, it's only for medicines in this round. And the next round, however, is likely going to include medical devices as well. And the current application period closes in March. And then the actual JSC meetings will happen in the period June to September. And you can select which time slot you want to apply for. Let's have a quick look at the JSC selection criteria, because we already said that not all products will be eligible for a JSC. So there are some key criteria that have to be met. First is the unmet medical need. The second one is the product has to be considered first in class. The product should also have a positive impact on patients, public health, or healthcare systems. There needs to be a cross-border dimension, a major union-wide added value, and an alignment with the union's clinical research priorities. And this is, of course, a relatively long and challenging list to complete. So we clearly see that there will be products, for example, in oncology, we see a lot of products in the same class or with a similar mechanism of action. So if your product is not the first one, then it may not be eligible for a JSC. However, the good news is that the national scientific advice processes, they're not going anywhere, so you can still apply for a scientific advice with the national HTA bodies. We wanted to share also some insights from published implementing acts and guidance documents with you. I'll try to keep it relatively concise because, of course, there's a ton of information and we only have a limited amount of time today. But of course, if you're interested in further detail, don't hesitate to reach out. So the first key implementing act that you need to be aware of is the implementing regulation that was published in May 2024 on the JCA. So it lays out the general procedures and timelines for the JCA. So some key highlights to remember are that the JCA process will very much run in parallel with the EMA marketing authorization procedure. So that's a key change because traditionally you may have been used to running the HTA submissions only after the EMA approval. Now with the JCA, this will all come forward. So you have to be ready to engage in the JCA at the same time as you engage with the EMA. Then the actual JCA scope should be finalized at the latest 10 days after the CHMP adopts its list of questions. And then the HTD has 100 days within the assessment scope being published to submit the dossier. And this will even be further reduced to 60 days under the accelerated marketing authorization procedure. And as you can imagine, with the sheer size of the JCA dossier and potentially a lot of different PICOs that you will have to deliver on, it will be humanly impossible to write such a dossier in 100 or even 60 days. So anticipation and preparation is really critical. So we really recommend to start much earlier to anticipate the likely PICOs and then start drafting the dossier so that when you get the final assessment scope, you can really draw from this draft and the building blocks to assemble the final JCA dossier. Then the JCA subgroup should finalize the revised draft JCA at the latest on the date of the European Commission marketing authorization. The HTD has a very short timeline, just a few days, to signal purely technical or factual inaccuracies. And then the coordination group should endorse the JCA report a maximum of 30 days after the EC decision. For the JSC, there is also an implementing regulation that has been published, and there are a few key things to retain. So for the JSC, there should be request periods. It says that there should be at least 2, but it's not a permanent process as you may have been used to with the GBA or other HTA bodies, but there will be fixed request periods. I'll probably not go into all of the details here, but one interesting feature is that the request format actually resembles to a fairly large extent the structure of the German scientific advice. So that for those of you who have experienced it may help you. And of course, if you have any questions about it, don't hesitate to reach out. I'll probably go a little bit faster, just conscious of the time. But of course, if you're interested in receiving the slides afterwards, please don't hesitate to reach out and we'll be happy to share. One of the key features, of course, as we mentioned, is that the JCA will run very much in parallel to the EMA marketing authorization procedure. So here, first of all, we're looking at the standard procedure. The standard procedure should take approximately 406 days. So I'll not go through every single step here, but it's important that you retain that when you submit to the EMA, you also have to submit some initial information to the coordination group in order to start the process. Then the coordination group will go through a number of different steps. So of course, there are some administrative steps, but then what is very important is the PICO survey. So there will be a survey among the member states to anticipate the PICOs and then to consolidate them. And ultimately, the final scope will be agreed on, and then the HDD will have 100 days to develop the dossier. In the course of the accelerated procedure, this will be only 60 days, and so the overall procedure should be approximately 277 days. One of the key things, of course, as we mentioned, is the determination of the assessment scope and most importantly, the PICOs in this process. So this will in part be accomplished by a PICO survey among the member states, but then the assessors, they will consolidate the proposed PICOs, seek some input from patients. Andreas will talk more about this later, and also potentially clinical experts, and then finalize the assessment scope. This is supposed to be finalized at the latest 10 days after the CHMP adopts the list of questions, but this delay will be shorter in case of an accelerated procedure or a variation in the marketing authorization. One very important framework to be aware of, which you may already be, but otherwise, let's quickly walk through it, is the PICO framework. So this is really key because it will determine the structure and the required evidence for your JCA. So first of all, of course, we have the P, which stands for population. So it's important to identify, do the member states request that the evidence is submitted for the full patient population of the label, or are there any relevant subgroups, which we frequently see? Then the I, of course, is the intervention. The C is the comparators, and this is probably where we will see the highest degree of variability because A, it can be products that may or may not be licensed in the EU or the member state, whereas we know that here we see strong national differences. In Germany, for example, the GBA can typically only use products as a comparator that have a marketing authorization, whereas other HTA bodies, such as the HS in France or the AIFA, typically allow themselves more leeway in referencing also off-label comparators. And as you can imagine, in oncology, especially, you can have a very wide variability of potential comparators, and you can really see countries on a continuum, some having access to all the latest targeted therapies, and other countries still having older chemotherapy regimens and sometimes very different chemotherapy regimens as comparators. So this is clearly a significant challenge because you can end up with a large number of PICOs that you need to deliver on. And of course, last but not least, we have the O for outcomes. So these are, of course, the endpoints that are measured in the trial and that should be presented in the dossiers. So as a manufacturer, you have to identify the PICOs that are likely to be requested very much in advance, because you only have a short time to submit your dossier. So we actually recommend to start 12, potentially 18 months prior to the submission to initiate this process. So first of all, doing a PICO survey in order to understand what your likely PICOs are going to be, and then prepare the draft dossier already, so that you are ready when the final assessment scope is communicated to you to be able to compile the dossier in the short timeline. Oh, sorry. Here is just a quick overview of the JCA dossier outline. I will probably not dwell on this in the interest of time. There's just one interesting aspect that I wanted to highlight here. So under chapter 3, the assessment scope, there is built in the possibility for you to actually provide a justification why some PICO data may be lacking. So that clearly means that there is an expectation that not every single time HDDs will be able to deliver on all of the PICOs. And of course, one key thing for you as a manufacturer will be to understand what are the PICOs that will be really critical for the key markets where you anticipate to be able to launch. And if there are PICOs that you can potentially not deliver on, or it would require an undue amount of effort, or it's simply not possible from a methodological point of view, then you may have that possibility to justify why those PICOs are not delivered on. Here we have summarized some of the key activities that we would recommend you to undertake in order to set yourself up for success for the JCA. So our recommendation is to start really early. So even at the stage when you develop the target product profile, to compare your TPP with the JCA requirements and ensure that already you build those into your TPP. Of course, it's very important to make sure that you build in the design aspects of the JCA into the pivotal study design, so that the evidence that you will receive from the pivotal studies can be the platform for the JCA and deliver on at least the most important PICOs. You, of course, have the opportunity of the joint scientific consultation, as we have already discussed. And even before, of course, filing for the JSC, it's important to develop a strategy for scientific advice. So there is, first of all, the question, do you want to go for a JSC? Do you feel that you will be eligible for a JSC? If yes, of course, we can help you to prepare the JSC submission and request it. If you feel that you would not be eligible for a JSC, or if ever your JSC application is rejected, you do have, of course, still another route, which is constituted by both the national level scientific advice meetings and by potentially advisory boards or one-on-one consultations that can still give you a similar level of insights. Then we've already alluded to the PICO anticipation. So this is really important to identify early on what the likely PICOs are going to be, but also to understand from which member states they are likely to emanate, so that you can really adapt your dossier, making sure that you deliver on the PICOs of at least the markets that you are planning to launch in. And then, of course, at the heart of it is the development of the JCA dossier. So that is something that will require a significant amount of time. So it's probably even more comprehensive than a German dossier. So we would really recommend to start this at least 12 months before the submission. And of course, there are a number of aspects that go into this, both from a strategic point of view, but then also from an operational point of view, to really write the dossier and compile all the evidence. And of course, a key part of this will also be the statistical analyses. So if you have not anticipated all of these, and these analyses were not part of your statistical analysis plan, there may be significant work, and it's important to ring fence enough capacity with your statisticians to deliver on all the analyses required for the JCA. So I'll probably go through over this quickly because I'm conscious of the time. So the key point that I wanted to make here is that while the JCA has gone live, we are still in the process of seeing member states adapting to it, and countries are in different places with this. So some have published draft legislation for how they would implement the JCA. Others are still in the process of doing so. There's an interesting recent example from Sweden that actually estimates that in order for the TLV to actually fully engage in this process, they actually need significant extra resources. So they need additional FTEs for the PICO development, to act as assessors, and to participate in the EU groups, which will lead to an extra cost for the TLV, additional FTEs. And interesting enough, Sweden actually already highlighted that they will only have the capacity to act as an assessor for only one medicine in 2025. So that will be very interesting to see at the end of the day how many JCAs the different member states will be able to take on. Of course, some of the well-resourced and HTA-savvy countries may be able to carry more of the load here, for example, thinking of France and Germany. But obviously, the idea is that all member states will contribute to this, and that also the smaller member states will act as assessors for the JCA. So just to conclude, we have already seen this one here. There's a lot of the implementing acts and guidance documents that have been published, but some that are still pending. So we definitely need to stay tuned, and we are following this closely and will inform you in due course about the recent developments here, especially for the medical devices. And of course, if you're interested in further information about ourselves, have a look on our website or contact me directly. We have experience in supporting manufacturers with dossiers in the different markets, and are also set up to help you with both joint scientific consultations and JCA. Thank you very much. And with that, I will hand over to Andreas.
Yeah, hello everybody. Thanks very much for your interest in joining us for this session. And I'd like to add the information on patient engagement. Where is the role of patient? What are the challenging aspects, and what are the opportunities also for both patients and industry in JCA? So first of all, where's the patient here? You may say this is the patient, the one without the white coat, or probably the lady, or it's probably one of the physicians. We don't know. And that's actually the interesting question also for the role of patients in JCA. Where's the patient, and what does he or she has to say? Well, to make a long story short, right at the beginning, is the glass half empty or is it half full? And I always tend to say it's half full, although you will see there are a couple of challenges when it comes to involving patients in JCA. Now, let's have a brief look to the role of patient involvement in HTA processes across Europe. That reaches from no formal patient involvement at all to participation in decision-making and voting rights even. And sometimes it's also depending on the region, like in Spain or Italy. And where is now the HTA? In the JCA and the patient participation there, it's right in the middle, I would say. So it allows participation in hearings only in some cases. So what, you may say? Well, let's have a little bit closer look to that. There are, and I'm using deliberately that slide from Justin. There is of course a national part of HTA, and now the JCA at the European level for some aspects, as Justin alluded to. And indeed, patients have a role in a couple of aspects, and I will talk to them. But don't forget that the final and most important decision is made on the national level. So it's very important to understand where the role of patients in those national processes are. And I should say that there was a workshop from theory to practice implementing the EU Health Technology Assessment Regulation meeting in early November last year. And let me quote one participant who said, "We really appreciate that including the patient's perspective is considered in the regulation and in the development of the process." Okay, very positive statement. So what are the specific roles of patients during JCA? There are three aspects. That's the assessment scope proposal, then the draft JCA and the summary reports, and JCA updates if new data is coming up. So in the first place, the patient experts can provide input on the assessment scope, the PICOs, at any time if requested by the assessor and co-assessor. That's important. If so requested by the assessor or co-assessor, so there's no place for volunteering that information without request. And that input to that assessment scope needs to be adopted by the JCA subgroup. Then once the JCA has been done and there is a summary report available, the patient experts again can provide input on the draft summary reports. And again, if so requested by the assessor and co-assessor, also on the revised JCA and the summary reports. But the final decision, of course, is made by the JCA subgroup. And basically the same role applies to JCA updates. And again, that needs to be requested if and the patient experts need to be invited. So there is a role, but is it very active? So another patient representative at that meeting I mentioned already said, "It's a pity we can only contribute upon invitation or request, and that proactive input is not explicitly planned." And that's certainly a difference to a couple of European, I should say, to a couple of national HTA processes. Now, how are patients selected for the JCA? Once again, there's no role for patient organizations in their entirety. There is a role for patient experts, and they may or may not be belonging to certain patient organizations. They can be patient experts based on their personal experience. It is required that they have the ability to generalize, ideally from different countries. So that's quite challenging if they are not really strongly involved in a patient organization. A list of relevant patients and patient experts will be compiled by the HTA Secretariat. And for doing so, the HTA Secretariat will consult members of the stakeholder network, the European reference networks for rare and complex diseases, OrphanNet, the national contact points for the implementation of the clinical trial directive, and the EMA. And they may, of course, also search for themselves in publicly available databases. And then they will provide to the JCA subgroup a list of potentially available experts, and they have to declare, however, a conflict of interest statement. I come to that in a minute. And then finally, the JCA subgroup makes the final decision on the experts to be involved. Now, only patient experts considered to have no conflict of interest during JCA can be considered. So how does the Commission define conflict of interest? And that's very important to look at, because it's much, much, much more restrictive than in many European processes, in many national processes. So there must not be any financial or other interest exceeding €1,000 over 3 years. So the sum of €1,000 aggregated €1,000 over 3 years. They must know employment, consultancy, strategic or advisory role, training, financial interest in any different aspects with a company involved in that process. And more importantly, there is also a conflict of interest considered if the patient expert is a lead member in an organization receiving funds from a developer. He or she can be a normal member, without any special function, but if that person belongs to the leadership, being member of the board, for instance, having a special role, then that would also already be considered a conflict of interest. And of course, there should also no interests of family members. Patients expert with a conflict of interest are excluded from further consultation. Some persons can be reappointed once the conflict of interest no longer exists or persists. Exceptionally, if no appropriate patient expert without conflict of interest is available, the commission may derogate from that rule, but it's a commission's decision. It's not a decision by the JCA subgroup, it's a decision by the commission. Now, what was that perceived by the European Patient Forum, so a big umbrella organization for patient interests on the European level? They are generally concerned. They suggest to put in place a scoring system instead, and to be more flexible, because basically you're excluding a big portion of very active patient advocates. And keep in mind, these patient advocates should be knowledgeable about the entire processes. Of course, they should have personal experience, and they should have experience that is generalizable from other patients, and more importantly, it should be multi-country experience. Typically, exactly those patient experts are involved in leadership activities of patient organizations. So, how well are patient organizations prepared for JCA? The European Patient Forum is offering a couple of very important sources of information that can be retrieved from the website. And there is a kind of learning program and an academy, which is called the European Capacity Academy, built on patient advocacy, which is a EU-funded project jointly by Eurodis and by UMIT Tyrol, so an Austrian private university in Innsbruck. Another quote from that meeting I mentioned: "We did not yet do the UCAPA course. It is nice that it's offered, but as a patient organization, you have so many tasks, and it would be relevant to know whether we would even be selected for providing input before dedicating time to this." That's a problem. I mean, you have to spend days there. You have to spend a lot of training, and you don't know whether a certain person will be selected. Now, in the interest of time, let me just say why it is so important to consider the right timing for involving patients during your development. Of course, there is a certain way of last-minute patient involvement. Keep in mind that at this moment, if you involve patients at the moment you are writing your dossier, all the data that will be presented for HTA has already been generated. So the PICOs have been used, and you have to design your clinical trial program. You have produced your data. So the patient relevant evidence base is what it is at this moment in time. However, you may miss out the added value of the untapped potential of evidence, patient relevant evidence that could be generated if you would have involved patient earlier. We just had last week a very, very interesting advisory board at an early stage, planning a phase 2 clinical trial with a client. And that client, of course, was already very knowledgeable about the therapeutic area. And it was so surprising how much evidence, how much input was provided by the patient experts to to change and to resharpen the clinical trial protocol, which will happen now. And that will, I'm convinced, help to improve that clinical trial protocol so that at the time of HTA assessment, there's more patient relevant, or there is an option for more patient relevant data. So that's the moment of that is important, and I will just say that, of course, ensuring favorable HTA and market access outcomes requires all these elements. You have to understand the context. You have to make sure that you know what is important to patients, and then you can plan your clinical trial program and define your PICOs appropriately. And at the end of the day, you can go for marketing authorization, and later on also for the HTA. There is an option to support patient organizations at a certain point in getting knowledge about their role in HTA to provide a product agnostic, of course, a product agnostic HTA training, but that's certainly something that needs to be planned very, very carefully. This is about patient preferences and how patient preferences can differ from expert preferences. This is, by the way, an IQWiC study, so from the German HTA Institute, and this was in depression, major depression. And while experts said remission is just the most important outcome, should be the most important outcome, patients said no, it's response. So there is no need for total remission, but for response. And of course, if a company is planning a clinical trial accordingly, they can justify the choice of their outcome parameters accordingly. So right at the beginning of the clinical development strategy, and that's so important that you involve this during your evidence generation phase, rather than only at the later stage of your dossier. So the class is half full, and let's make sure we fill it more. So in a nutshell, there is patient participation in JCA, but it's, despite some criticism, it underscores the growing importance of the patient voice in HTA in total. But the timely generation of patient-relevant data is key to, and it's the cornerstone of good HTA. Skillful patient engagement, do's and don'ts, right timing and format is key to ensure that the patient voice is included during development. With that, and if you miss that out, actually, you miss out an opportunity. If you want to learn more about admedicum, and in the interest of time, I don't want to spell this out. We do patient engagement from early development through to commercialization. Please see our website, www.admedicum.com, and I'm very happy to take any questions. Thanks very much for your attention. Rob? All right. I mean, are there any questions from the audience?
So maybe while we wait for the audience to ask questions, I can ask some that have been thrown around quite frequently that are probably on everyone's minds. So the first one is, given the tight timelines for JCA dossier preparation and concerns around duplication of efforts, what practical steps can companies take to streamline evidence generation while ensuring alignment with both EU and national HTA requirements?
Sure, absolutely. I'm happy to take this one. So there's probably two key things that companies can do. The first one is, even before the initiation of the pivotal clinical trial, to seek input both from HTA bodies and patients on the clinical trial design. So as we've seen, there is the route of the joint scientific consultations that is open to HDDs, but there are also other routes, such as the national level scientific advice meetings or advisory boards that you can leverage in order to make sure that your pivotal trial is fit for purpose and delivers the evidence that you will need for the JCA. So that's the first key thing. The second key thing is really to start as early as possible with your JCA dossier. And as we've seen, it should start with the anticipation of the likely PICOs to understand what are the likely PICO requests that you will be facing. And then on this basis, to start drafting the dossier so that you have a very robust draft ready when the full assessment scope is published. Because as we've seen, the timeline is very short, just 100 or potentially even 60 days in order to compile the dossier. So it's very important to prepare well in advance in order to be able to manage the actual JCA submission in such an ambitious timeline.
Yeah, and I think there is another question regarding patient involvement in JCA. There is criticism about the lack of proactive input opportunities, as I alluded to. How can industry and patient organizations collaborate earlier in development to integrate patient preferences meaningfully without compromising timelines? That's a very important question. Of course, patient involvement, as all stakeholder involvement, like KOLs, take time, and you need to plan ahead. You shouldn't do that weeks before you need to submit your protocol, for instance, to the IRB or to the ethics committee. So it is very important right at the beginning of planning your clinical trial program to understand when it's the best time to involve patients. And I can tell you from experience, as early as possible, because we need then to help to bring in the right patient experts. We need to anticipate already potential conflict of interest. We need to understand which countries you want to involve and what kind of expertise is necessary. And then it is important. It is possible to help co-design a clinical trial, to discuss PICOs, and also potentially to set up a patient preference study. The patient preference study, and we should be realistic about that, takes, depending on the therapeutic area, of course, everything between 12 and 18 months. That's I think it's a fair timeline, including all the necessities for internal alignments and certainly IRB approvals. I think that's fair to assume. Okay, are there any further questions?
Yes, there is one question from the audience. So, do you envisage any risk, at least initially, that the JCA deliverables would be somehow assessor dependent or country dependent? That is, reflecting methodologies and thinking adopted by the country experts that have been selected to conduct the assessment. If so, any measure to standardize or avoid potential issue?
Yes, I'm happy to have a first step at that one. And then, of course, Andreas, feel free to chime in, obviously. I think that is clearly a risk. So as we have seen so far among the member states, there are very different practices in terms of health technology appraisals. And while the goal of the JCA is to harmonize all of this, at the end of the day, it will be the member states that will drive the JCA with an assessor and a co-assessor. And of course, the countries that will drive the process will leave an imprint on it and will make a significant difference. So if you have, let's say, France and Germany running the show, or two of the smaller member states, that could make a very significant difference. So I think, unfortunately, there isn't anything that you can upfront do to overall avoid this. However, what you can do is, and what I would really recommend is, by early on doing the PICO assessment, you can understand which PICOs are likely requested by which member state. And if you feel that there are some PICOs that are either not feasible to deliver on, or let's say if they are coming from one smaller member state that may not represent the majority of the other member states, but that might actually at the end of the day have a significant impact on the process if they're an assessor or a co-assessor, then there are potentially some strategic choices to be made in terms of which PICOs you may want to deliver on and you can deliver on, because obviously there will still be opportunities to also present further data in the national level procedures. And let's just assume a scenario where you would end up with a couple of smaller member states as assessor and co-assessor. That would come to a very different stance on the PICOs than, for example, Germany or France or Italy or some of your key strategic priority markets would do. Then, of course, you could still have the discretion to focus on those elements in the national level submissions. Of course, you don't have a choice but to engage in the JCA, but in this case, it would actually lead to a situation where JCA would probably have less impact and the national level procedures would have a stronger impact.
And I guess the same we will see the same with the patient involvement. I mean, those assessors and co-assessors who are used to patient engagement and patient involvement in their countries, they may be more prone to do that also and to ask for patient experts on the European level. And certainly, it will be very, very interesting to see that how that evolves in that year. All right. Looks like there are no other questions. I think with that, Eva, unless there is you find another question, I think we can wrap up that meeting on behalf of Justin and myself. We thank you for your attention, and please reach out to both Justin Stindt Consultants as well as to admedicum if you have any questions regarding the subjects we discussed today. With that, have a very great evening. Thanks. Bye.
Yes, thank you very much. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.